Our next speaker is James Bennett. He has a long history in commercial space entrepreneurship and its policy and regulation. He has published 2 books on technology, culture, and society from an anthropological perspective, and is a non-resident scholar at the Space Policy Institute, George Washington University, and a space fellow in the Economic Policy Center in London. His paper is on a development of a model framework for examining language and cultural issues in human starfaring civilizations. Welcome, James.
Okay, sound level. Good. Well, normally I've just started on a talk like this with an explanation of why interstellar travel should be taken seriously. Well, we can forget that one. Also, part of my talk is going to include some talk about hibernation and torpor in interstellar travel. I usually have to spend some time explaining why that's important. Thanks to John, I don't have to do that either. So we can just get into the main area of interest. First of all, just some points about what I am assuming in creation of this. And by the way, this is a thought experiment. So I'm using some very rough analogues. I'm not expecting to be either a prophet or even a forecaster. I'm not going to try to defend any particular numbers here, because the important point is thinking about what happens after we get to not just one star, but a number of stars and have an interstellar civilization. In that vein, I believe that we will see settlements on a number of star systems within a 15 light year radius of the solar system, or the home system. The human civilizations will be wealthy. We're not going to go unless we are reasonably wealthy. Bennett, who was the anthropologist who studied Polynesian voyaging in some detail and did the first demonstration voyage using a traditional outrigger canoe from Hawaii back to Tahiti to prove that Polynesians could do deliberate voyaging to specific destinations using traditional navigational methods, estimated that when the Polynesians set out to do a long-distance exploration with one of their large double-hulled ocean-going canoes, it took about 10% of the GDP of the entire entity, the island or kingdom, that sent it for about a year in order to build and stock and crew the crew that went on a 2,000 to 4,000 mile voyage. So even back then, this kind of long-distance exploration was always a significant percentage of the wealth of the society that did it, and that will probably be the case in interstellar civilization. So I'm going to assume a fair amount of resources go into this, and it's going to enable, more long-distance, larger, more long-distance, more frequent voyages beyond the first initial exploratory voyages, which most of the discussion in this meeting, which has been excellent all across the board, have tended to focus on let's just get to Alpha Centauri, let's get to Proxima, let's make it happen at least once. If it happens once, I think it's going to happen many times, and it's going to happen to many star systems, and we're going to have a very interesting civilization in a relatively short period of time. I think that traditional transportation economics indicate that vessels are going to have a tendency to get fairly large. 100 people on an initial ship is reasonable, but I think that these are basically going to be mobile O'Neill colonies with, if they're laser powered, it's going to be an enormous amount of laser power required, but we've got the sun, we've got the stars to fuel them, so it's not impossible. Once we have laser batteries on both sides of the voyage, then there's no reason why return voyages shouldn't be a feature of this culture. Ships will be soon they'll be self-healing because they're not going to make it unless they have some capability of that sort. If they are self-healing, then at the end of the voyage, they'll be as capable of going back as they were of getting there. And there will always be people that want to go back. By the way, this addresses one of the ethical concerns that was brought up, which is, is it truly ethical to to raise children in another star system, which has a much smaller population than Earth, that is going to lack a number of features that Earth has. If nothing else, it has the history there. But if you have two-way travel, then you can say, well, if you want to go back, you can go back, even if it's a relatively rare phenomenon, which I don't think it will be. I have outlined 3 cases, one of which is, I call it pessimistic, which is that we only 1/20th of the speed of light. The optimistic is that we have 20% of the speed of light. And the very optimistic is that we have 30% of the speed of light. Talking to Jeff Grayson, well, I think 20% is within the range of what's achievable in the relatively near future. I tend to agree with that. What I'm not discussing, no faster than light travel, no wormholes, no warp drives. Interstellar sublight travel it's possible. There's no physical laws against it. It is just engineering. And I'd say that as somebody who's spent 10 years sitting in morning engineering meetings just to develop a module for a Falcon 9 type rocket. Just engineering, and involves an enormous amount of work and brain power. And I'm not trying to minimize that, but it's different from saying wormholes or warp drives or anything like that, which at this point is speculative fantasy. I'm not assuming cryonics. That again is not, it's not demonstrated. There are some real reasons to believe that it would be very difficult or take a long time to achieve. I'm not assuming so-called uploading of loading human minds into computers. There is a number of issues with that, and part of which is we don't know enough about what consciousness really is to assume that it can be successfully implanted into a computer. One point of view says, oh, free me up and I'll be, this immortal being of immense power. The other one says, I'll be dead and there's this computer impersonating me. So, opinions differ on that one. There may be aliens. I'm not going to talk about them. Now we get to the part which you basically have already heard a very masterful presentation on, so I don't have to go into a great deal of detail. We take a somewhat different approach to thinking about it. Since this is a thought experiment, I'm doing a much more simple thing, which is saying I'm going to use analogues from the biological world, and I go on hibernation in mammals. It's, as you pointed out, there are many examples of hibernation in mammals. There's been some recent research on torpor states in squirrels, which are really interesting because they do show, as John pointed out, no muscle wastage, more immunity from radiation damage, whole set of things which make it very attractive for space flight. My interest in this is what kind of torpor versus awakeness cycle is there going to be sustainable over a long voyage. I call it compression of experience of time, and I just refer to it as a ratio. So, again, going on natural analogs, let's say, well, bears do one season on, one season off. So a 50% time compression ratio is adequate for thought experiment purposes, which I refer to as the bare minimum. So that's the first part of it. And the other is extended lifespan. Yes, longevity. And that is very simple as well. We can discount turtles and that kind of thing because cold-blooded animals are sufficiently different from us that their longevity, is not all that relevant to our discussion. Complex warm-blooded mammals are. Greenland right whale is a very interesting case because we have some evidence that they are achieving lifespans in the 250 plus years. CSIRO, the Australian Science Agency, did a DNA analysis on a captured dead whale, but and their estimate was its age was around 268 years. It was a healthy adult. It showed no signs of what we would consider aging, feebleness, or whatever. And although they did not have tag and release programs several hundred years ago, they had the functional equivalent, which is that it was not uncommon for whales to get harpooned but not die and to escape. And the lance head would get encysted inside the body. Eventually, the whale would get caught, and the whalers would cut out the lance heads as they were flensing the flesh. And since the harpoons were often dated or datable by style, they were finding 200-year-old lance heads encysted in adult whales. So this sort of independently verifies what the DNA analysis was saying, at least in the case of Greenland right whales. Long longevity is quite normal. The interesting thing is that the genetics of Greenland right whales aren't much different from other types of right whales. There's no secret sauce. There's no special biological thing about them that explains why they live this long. So more study would be really interesting on this. In general, as far as longevity goes, I'm kind of surprised that there's so much discussion here of interstellar travel, and of course, it's treated as a serious topic. Given the amount of money that's going into longevity research right now, and again, John's given a good detailed discussion of that, a lot more money is going into longevity research than is going into interstellar travel research. I would say we should probably not always baseline, an 83-year-old lifespan. We should be including scenarios in which 120 or even 250-year lifespans are reasonable. As he mentioned, there's an existing, 122-year-old lady. She's really not fit for being a Starship crew person, but there's plenty of research on improving the quality of old age. And if some people can live to that age, then many people can live to that age once we figure out a little more of the medical issues involved in it. As for 250 years, well, I say there's a mammalian analog with whales, and we should be able to see that. So, in the cases I'm looking at, I have a pessimistic case where we have 0.05 C. We have long distance, long travels to Alpha Centauri. We have no extra longevity, and we have no torpor benefits. In that case, we are either a generation ship or something very close to it. That's not a very interesting scenario to me, so I'm not going to talk about it any further. The optimistic case is assuming a 1/5 of light speed, and I'm using a kind of an airline definition of block-to-block travel, not counting whatever is needed for acceleration or deceleration. This is just what the trip would end up being. In this case, also looking at longevity to 120, healthy longevity to 120, and looking at a 50% torpor ratio, again, the bare minimum. Very optimistic case is, not 1/3, but 0.3 C, 90% compression ratio. In other words, most of the time will be in torpor. And he did show some extreme cases like that, but for a much shorter durations. But, let's say we really crack the medical issues on torpor and can push it to 90%, and with 250-year lifespans. So well, the interesting thing about this is with multiple star systems colonized with relatively rapid transit between the stars in terms of the experienced lifespans, with many people spending time, and many of the star travelers spending a good deal of their time in torpor and further extending their lifespan on the calendar. You start to get a group of people, the star travelers, who begin to pull away from the rest of society in terms of their both their chronological origins and their outlook. In a way, we now have a community of one-way time travelers. And as more people do this, as more people come back and forth, people go to multiple star systems, they will have to figure out how they will interact with the rest of society, because, looking at the culture shock of people who have been away from their home culture for only a couple decades, there is some culture shock in returning. And in a way, these people will never return to their original culture because there'll be so much change. I happen to think that many of the things that Dewdney talks about actually are good things. So we will see a lot of diversity, a lot of divergence in the human species. And this, on one hand, will be highly interesting. On the other hand, it will be leading to culture shock and various things. Star travelers essentially need to form their own mini society, or maybe several different societies, considering that they'll be of many different cultural origins, and form a community of their own, which will gradually have to form a distinct linguistic form for themselves. So the question is, what will this culture look like? What will be the features of the language? And then we can look at historical analogs where social entities have formed their own stable communication methods over time. The Catholic Church, for instance, uses Church Latin, which is basically a variant of classical Latin, but gradually updated as you need to have words to describe television or automobiles or whatever. But they have their proper Latin declinations and all that. A Jesuit missionary who's been to China back in the 18th century or so would come back after 3 or 4 decades. That's a good analog to a star traveler in a lot of ways. And although many things would have changed back home, he can speak to his colleagues in Church Latin, and has a little enclave where he will feel at home until he can acclimatize himself more to the society around him. So it's worth looking at historical cases of the groups which are set apart a bit from the rest of society, but still have to interact with society. And you can look at the Amish, for instance, but they get by not just keeping their language stable, but also by keeping much of their technology and interactions with the rest of the world. I don't think star travelers are going to be that regressive. It would be kind of ironic for them to be that conservative, but they will be conservative because you're having people with different origins and experiences relating to each other. And they have to, you have to be able to accept your colleagues. I mean, you have to just think in human terms. What happens if you get somebody today who was born in 1800, they grew up in 1800 to 1820, and then it goes away for long periods of time, but comes back. Their experiences and attitudes will no longer be that of somebody born in 1820, because they will be changed by interactions with other people over time in different places. But to some extent, the language of this group has got to be backward compatible. You've got to be able to at least integrate this person in and communicate with them. And you're going to have people with all sorts of they'll be coming from all sorts of different cohorts. And the natural tendency of people to have generational attitudes, we have boomers and zoomers and millennials and Gen X and all this. And there is certain assumptions about when you meet someone, oh, they're from this generation, so they're probably like X, Y, Z. So that can't be the case with a community which is in this way transtemporal. You have to have something in common which will allow different generations to mix without the generational bias. This community is going to be very interesting because they're going to be coming and having experience with many different cultures on different planets, different origins. They will be from different original origins on Earth to begin with. So you have to have some commonality. Probably you'll take whatever were the languages of wider communication at the time the star travel begins. English is an obvious possibility. Chinese is certainly a possibility because these are two cultural areas that are very active in space now. I don't see them becoming less active over the future. It might be a hybrid pidgin language incorporating English, Chinese, and other elements, which would be kind of interesting. But it's more important that it retain commonality over time and place for these people, yet still be close enough to the natural languages that are being spoken around. There's also the possibility that some human communities will take fairly extreme forms of adaptation, either to the local circumstances, i.e., if you're going to live on a heavy gravity planet, you probably are going to need genetic modification. Who knows how far that needs to go, depending on what the gravity is on such places. People might adapt in other ways. Even something as small as a very different day-night cycle might require adjustment of the genetic level. Anyway, there will always be a question of how much modification do you accept for yourself, and to what extent you become a kind of conservative, or I kind of like an Amish star traveler, where you deliberately stay towards the baseline of humanity, even when people around you are adopting or changing further than that. So it will be an interesting anthropological issue. Also, I think you're going to see they will form some sort of community with some kind of structure to it, so that people can know that when I, arrive at a distant planet in a different distant star system, there will be certain norms and customs which I will know how to deal with when I get in, and that provides a comfort zone from which you can then learn what the customs and norms and maybe the languages of the people on that planet actually are. So this comfort zone needs some kind of structure, but it probably will not be hierarchical, because it's hard to maintain any kind of bureaucratic hierarchy when you have communication gaps in the tens or hundreds of years. I don't think there will be any interstellar empires so long as light travel is slower than light. I mean, you look at decision cycles in something like the Spanish colonial empire, where everything had to be referred back to Madrid for decision and then back again, which meant a 2 to 4 year cycle between somebody in the colonies asking what to do about this and getting the answer back. That barely functioned at all, and it wasn't very successful dealing with either local rebels or with things like English or Dutch pirates. And that's a very short time cycle compared to an interstellar, interplanetary cycle. So, galactic empires, you can forget that. I also don't think it will be democratic because, again, it's hard to sustain a democracy when, the delegates have to on a 40 or 60-year journey or whatever. The electoral cycles, you can't even imagine how those would be put together. When the founding fathers of the U.S. got together, there was a lot of doubt as to whether a democracy could function over a distance between Maine and Georgia, which was about a 30-day trip in those days. They did make it work for the few decades until steam travel started to reduce that drastically. But, I've never seen a democracy go on a cycle where there's, a year, even a year's gap between the constituent and the center. So neither a hierarchy nor a democracy, and then it becomes something like the old British Commonwealth, currently the Commonwealth of Nations, of which Canada is a member, but there's no real central authority. There's no decision-making apparatus. There's just kind of a generally shared set of ideas and principles, and some institutions which work primarily voluntarily. So I would say that the society, or whatever you want to call it, I don't like to call it the Space Navigators Guild, because if you've seen Dune, it doesn't have good vibes. But somewhere between a fraternal order or even something with quasi-religious elements, I think, people will go throughout the solar system for God, gold, and glory, just like they've always gone out to the edge of wherever. Interstellar travel is different. I think, there's no point going to Alpha Centauri to get rich because, it's going to take a long time to get back to enjoy the money, and there's not going to be that many casinos on Alpha Centauri for quite a while. So it's hard to be a conspicuous consumers. So you will go for transcendental reasons. Some may be overtly religious, others may be philosophical, political, whatever. These are the kind of people that will likely go. I think a lot of people on Earth are going to get seduced into, beautiful virtual realities where everything always goes your way. And it will take somebody who says it is important to make a difference in the real world and to change the real world. And that is the type of people that star travelers will be drawn from. Eventually, there's going to be a gap between that and much of the rest of the human race. But it's a gap that I think will allow them space to come up with unique benefits, unique thoughts, unique means of communication that wouldn't otherwise exist. And that, in and of itself, may be sufficient justification for star travel. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We have time for one brief question, if anyone's got something they would like to raise.
Yes. Are you arguing for transforming future astronauts either genetically or cyborgically, for example, before they even join these groups that are going to travel?
No, actually, I think that the star travelers themselves will tend more towards the baseline human condition. It will be groups of colonists or groups of people, in the solar system that will choose to adapt themselves to new conditions. Star travelers need to be able to adapt to many different conditions, and that kind of argues for staying in the baseline condition. Thank you.
Thank you, James.